Welcome to the Habits of Great Coaches. This is episode 2. Well, it's possibly episode 1 after the preface, but it is our second recorded episode, so let's go with that. I welcome again Lee Baines. Hello to you.
Hello.
Today we're talking about chapter 1. We will kick it straight off with our iceberg statement. The iceberg phrase for chapter 1 is that you can't get credit for what you did if you can't prove that something changed as a result of what you did. And this is from our first chapter, which is Judged.
Judged.
You changed behaviour. So that's our iceberg tip. In other words, prove it. You say you did a good job. I can't give you credit for being good if you can't prove to me that you changed something. And now we'll dive deep beneath the waterline and discuss that. We know that great coaches will know that their mission and the consistency of their remuneration depends on their ability to change behaviour and to get results. In other words, great coaches hold themselves accountable to get those results, and they lose their job if they don't get it. And on the flip side, we will talk about two different varieties, one of which I called a government type behaviour, and Lee gave it a different name. It relates to productivity or the lack thereof, or a busy-ness mindset as opposed to a productivity mindset. Effectively, what we're saying is that there's a difference between a mission and a job, and great coaches will find the mission in what they have to do, as opposed to a job, which is where you turn up, check in, and receive your paycheck and go home. And we don't like those kind of jobs. I mean, we know that there's a necessity to do many of those, but if we're going to be talking about the habits of what great coaches do, then that's not necessarily it. Before I dive any deeper into that mission and job binary dichotomy, Lee, do you have any initial thoughts you want to weigh in on?
I mean, being most of my life in the public sector on that side of things, it's because of the accountability that is held a lot on the side of public sector. And this is where myself and Greg will have slightly different perspectives on this because of our nature of our backgrounds. And yes, the essence of a great coach is to be absolutely mission specific. But when you're dealing with the background of that and the administration bureaucracy that we can come across, then the other types are actually pretty good at that and do take a lot off there, and a good mutual supporting relationship between the two types is actually where you want to be, and understanding each other's strengths and weaknesses and supporting each other on that. Unfortunately, it's when one takes control of the other, and I mean that in both ways. When one takes control of the other and tries to dominate the other's way of doing things with their way of doing things, that's when frictions and problems can arise. But the coach is almost at the pinnacle of the mission orientated, and will need support of the more administrative, bureaucratic, just to clock in and do certain things. And then there's on the worst case of that spectrum, and I see it as a spectrum, is the one who just clocks in and basically a job avoids for the rest of their time, which is the worst case of the busyness people. But most of the time, people who do a job and sometimes do really well, sometimes don't. But that support, that having that culture and that connectivity between both types is essential, because the coach can't be on their own. There is always a supporting mechanism behind coaches and organisations that is needed, and mutual respect will go a long way there.
Yeah, you're right. And some years ago, I came across a book called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath, which was subheading as How to Affect Change When Change is Difficult. And within that is a concept that allows a coach who's mission focused to wrap himself up in those specific administrative, do it this way, micromanaging, hold your hand through this type of busyness. Wrapped up in that concept of switch and how to make change when change is difficult is 3 different ways to approach causing change. And what I loved about that is that it took what we're going to talk about in this chapter, being the difference between a mission and a job, it took that and said, actually, there is genuinely a time to do it. There's genuinely a time to be busy and to do a job and to turn up and just get it done. And maybe it's less mission focused than what we're altruistically talking about. But I've firsthand had experiences in China where the usual coaching strategy just doesn't work because you're dealing with individuals who you're going to struggle to communicate with. And so talking to them intellectually to provide them with analytical information that helps them to change their behavior doesn't seem to be very effective. Or you could motivate them through the emotional part of them or the subconscious. But in many of the athletes in China, they were not actually interested in being an athlete. That wasn't their choice. They were shoved into those schools, and so they didn't have the same motivation. So I couldn't quite speak to them in that way. And so in those circumstances, I had to do the alternative of the three, which is I couldn't speak to them intellectually. I couldn't motivate them emotionally. I had to just simply shape the path and say, right, you're here, do this. Knowing that doing this was the best way possible in the context of the circumstance to get the job done and to get the outcome.
And that's the key element here, is that culture is king, that understanding your environment and understanding all coaching and leadership is situationally based. If you don't know the situation and do it contextually, you'll mess it up. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And China and a British, a Western orientated versus that sort of orientation will be very different, and you've got to act differently. But also, there's subcultures within those organisations and those cultures as well. So it's whatever the culture is dominant there. If you can change it by being the lead and the leader, fine. But it is the most difficult change to enact and the longest to take and the most time consuming, but also the most effective when you do it successfully. But as a coach, you may not be in charge of it, and you have to deal with the situation you've got. And the same as being a middle management in the army, as a major or below, or a sergeant or above, you've got to deal with the situation you have. So therefore, you've got to coach and lead in the way that you can do within those constraints around you. And you may find yourself going down particular paths that are not the way you'd like to, or the most optimum, but you have to deal with that situation. And that sometimes is part of the but you can only show that your way is working if you can prove what it is that you can do to change that. And that comes across a lot. And in my time in the army, that's something I've learned from a junior officer's perspective, is the concept of being called lucky. Rather than, so even if you're successful, then if somebody can call you lucky and then get away with it because there's no proof to say otherwise. And that I found has been a sort of way to make sure that even though someone was producing excellent results, just to say that you were lucky meant you could dismiss those results and say that, do you know what, it would have happened without you anyway, so it wasn't your team, and that's more importantly. And that only at the end of my army career did I realise, hang on a minute, I've been sort of pup here. I've been lucky 7 or 8 times in my career, which was my 7 or 8 posts. It's only afterwards when I got out of that culture and realised, hang on a minute, I've been sold something here. I've been conned. And so that's, again, proving it. And only later on did I realise I have to prove that. And I'm in the current job right now where I'm looking at how do I prove our organisation's effectiveness. It's the only way that you can stop the naysayers or those ones that don't want to change anything, or those ones who want to take credit from you and your team. It's essential that you have things like start state, journey of, and end state that you're looking at. And coming back to the idea of, what is it that what can you show, what can you prove that your methods have been successful? And start and end state is usually the best way of doing it, with what your actions and plans are in between.
Yeah, you're right. Start and end stage is key. And we mentioned in the preface about how it may have been Benjamin Franklin, it may have been a Dalai Lama, but it's often said that tell me and I will forget, show me and I may remember, and involve me and I will learn. And this concept that is spoken about in Chip and Dan Heath's book, Switch, is doing exactly that. And the metaphor that he uses is of a man sitting on top of an elephant, and there's a destination where the man wants the elephant to go somewhere. And if I, as an external person, tries to talk to the man on top of the elephant, there is a moment where you talk to the man sitting on top of the elephant, where you get lost and you say, the reason that this elephant is not going where it's supposed to is because the person sitting on top of the elephant just isn't fucking listening.
Yeah.
And no, time and time again, I'm sure you would have been sat in a military presentation where someone has done death by PowerPoint, where they've been told to deliver. They've been told to deliver a lesson, and they will put an effusively busy slide full of words, and they will stand there and they will read it verbatim.
Read it, yeah.
And everyone has fallen asleep, or if they're not...
We'll also read, my name is Major Lee Baines. I am an army officer. I'm like, you really have to read that, do you? You're not sure on that. And I've assessed and trained presentation techniques throughout my army career, and the amount of times that's happened from quite senior and long and senior people and lots of experience and very confident in front of people, and then suddenly they're put with a PowerPoint, and it's almost like there's something really hypnotic on the screen as well, where they have to stare at it and speak like that.
One of the reasons this occurs is because they've seen somebody else do it before, and they think that that's the normal, the way that you're supposed to do it, and nobody tells them any differently. But if they were ever asked at the end of that particular week or lesson period, they said, have you taught people about strategic invasion of a foreign land? They say, oh yeah, we gave that presentation, so they've been taught they should know how to do it. And that's where the disconnect comes about. We see that in sports coaching and athletics coaching as well, where you say, you'll have a group personal trainer, a group fitness instructor standing in the room, 6, 7, 8, maybe 20 or 40 people all stood around, and the man in the middle or the woman in the middle is saying, on my command, I want you to go to your stations, you pick up the bar, put the barbells on your shoulders, you're going to make sure that you've got the collars tightened, then you're going to press up overhead and deep squat. I'm going to do it 14 times. I'm going to do that 3 times with a 30-second rest. On my command, go. And...
What was that? Sorry, what? I've just told you. Why have you not learned everything that I just said immediately?
Yeah, why did you not learn
everything I've said immediately now?
The disconnect is, because you've said it does not mean that the person has learned. And you should not be holding your job because you can recount or you can recite or you can memorize content. You should be holding your job because the room full of 40 people were facilitated to improve because of what you did, not necessarily because of what you said, and sometimes because of what you said. And so it brings us back to our pinnacle iceberg statement, is that I'm not going to give you credit for reading the presentation up on the wall. I'm not going to give you credit for recounting every single technical model's details for how to do a barbell back squat. You don't get any credit for that. You get credit for the outcome that we're attempting to achieve.
That's something that we've come across in the military as well a lot, is the creation of training packages and recruits. Now, these training packages, there's pluses and minuses to the way it's done. And so the mentality of, and you'll see it sometimes in the American army where they get told off for something and they shout out, I have been taught, but I have not done it properly. I'm paraphrasing, but it's, I have been taught, but I have not understood, or something like that. And they shout that when they're being punished for something. And I think it happens in West Point or in other officer academies or even in phase 1 of recruit training, where they shout out they have been taught. Now, yes, they have been taught at, and that's a lot of the time is what this training mechanism is. It's like, I will talk at you for 40 minutes straight with this script from this PowerPoint, and at the end of it, I expect you to have remembered all of it. That sort of learning is one of the most inefficient learning patterns available. And there's a whole pyramid side. The lecture is at the bottom of effectiveness, and it goes all the way up to that interactivity and that people doing teaching is a good way of learning, funny enough, because you actually, it embodies itself more in your mentality and your mind and your behaviours when you're teaching somebody else. And it's actually a big part of the way that we taught leadership and management too. corporals and sergeants was getting them to get up and teach us about something, and then we can critique the way they taught that subject, and the subject would be something that's related to leadership and management. So they would be, and it's also building the skills up of research, choosing what they're going to pick, and then the method that they're going to present it on, and then we'll see their style. So comment on the content as well as on the way they did it. And then turning around, and one of my first questions to the rest of it is, what did you learn? And they turn around and go, didn't learn anything. Well, fail. If they've not learned anything, what's the point? You can just talk about anything you want then. Like they're doing a filibuster. So, it's just, it's communication. The essence of communication is if you're turning around and thinking that the responsibility of receiving a message is the receiver and not the sender, then you're immediately screwing it up. The sender is responsible for the message. If your sender doesn't send it correctly, it's their fault. They're the ones that have messed it up. If the means has not been done properly, the tone is not done properly, the content's not done properly, why is that the receiver's fault? Now, you can have a message sent excellently and the receiver still hasn't got it. Well, maybe there's something the audience wasn't ready for. Maybe the audience wasn't the first right type of audience to be receiving this message. So there's all sorts of factors involved in a message being sent and received, and that's what a lot of the times this mentality of just speaking a message out and having that thing of I've ticked this box, it has been said, therefore move on to the next thing, is part of that mentality that, again, relating back to the iceberg comment, it needs to be smashed and changed. That is nowhere, it's got no business or place in the coaching or leadership role. But you'll see it's a norm in a lot of organisations, which is crazy. And the reason why it is a norm is because it's easy. Because of overburdened. Sometimes it's just a reason for it is because there's a lot of stress, a lot of busyness, a lot of activity. A lot of people are stressed and therefore want to take the easier route. That then there's like water down a mountain, finds the easiest route. But unfortunately, it's not the most effective. Almost all the most effective things that happen in life are not the easiest. And so therefore, that's the essence of the coach and leader is actually the difficult thing that you do and put the time in now means your life is easier later. And that's where the essence of this mission command and this ownership and the responsibility and how do we get the change of behaviour becomes important. Because once you've set the culture, you've set the environment, you've set everybody in there, it takes a lot of time and effort at the front, but it becomes so much easier later on because everyone just then clicks and does it. And then suddenly your job as a leader becomes you're just a person at the end on the ship's tiller giving it a light touchdown, and that's all you're doing at the end. And that's then the journey. And that's what we'll be discussing in more detail as we go through the entirety of the book.
And it's so brilliant that you've mentioned the mission command because that does. I do want to skip over certain elements of this chapter that is going to be available for people to read. So we're not necessarily skipping over, but mission command, which is that mission-oriented approach to leadership and to coaching. And my recollection and my research, as per you, is that it's a style that was developed by the German military and adopted by the better part of the UK military. And it's got a name which I can't think of, and I'm sure you'll tell me. And its paradox or its opposite also has a name. And in our book, we talk about the distinct differences between the two approaches. And I'd love it if you could perhaps go through some of the examples of what a mission command approach is and then contrast that with its opposite. And let me just take a quick step back. Mission command is about results focused. The opposite is about micromanaging to appear busyness. And even though that's perhaps not their focus, that's how we can draw what we started into where we're going.
Right, let me. Right, so the two terms that Greg was after is Befehlstaktik and Ausgangstaktik, German terms, and one is more dynamic and the other one's more steady. Now, the two systems are not one good, one bad, and I just want to make it pains at them, and we go into more detail as to the bullet points and what comes out of it. But if you have, the two are related to the situation, and that's a key element. So Befehlstaktik is this more ploddy one, right, which is where you have a lack of trust in your subordinates. You have a more concentrated micromanagement. You've got close supervision. You have restrictive control. You base it on precise orders. Hierarchy is key. You have a centralized control. You believe that subordinates should be motivated by threats, and you believe that you are low trust in the professional competence of your soldiers or coaches. And you believe that the main objective is to keep that movement forward, as in capturing ground. But there is a mental inflexibility. So you make a plan and you stick to the plan. That's the key thing. Now, that is actually beneficial if you do have, for example, conscript soldiers. If you do have really poorly trained individuals, or you have a really low motivation levels, you have a society or culture that is already like this, and you have to adhere to this sort of system. Now, it does mean, though, you're getting a base standard. So if you do, and it's a lot of pressure on the leader on this one, because you have to come up with all the orders, you have to come up with all the, you have to be on top of all your subordinates all the time. But it does mean you'll get a base level. And if you didn't think you would get that base level because the material of people you had around you was low and there hadn't been much investment in their training, their motivation, etc., then you'll get that level. So things like the beginning of World War One with the mass conscription of the British Army, it was very much there because of this. Now, so therefore, you can see the reasoning for that, but it just gets you to a standard, and a low one at that, but at least you're getting everybody there and at least moving towards. Unfortunately, it then becomes a mentality, and that's the difference. When it becomes a mentality, and that this happens throughout. So a good example is Colonel H. Jones during Goose Green, the Battle of Goose Green in 1982, in the Falklands War. You had two individuals in there. Chris Keeble was the regimental 2IC, and Colonel H. Jones was the company, the regimental commander of 2 Power, 2nd Battalion, the Parachute Regiment. And that battle is one of the most fascinating battles to look at from these two's perspective. I would argue, and I'll state it like that so it's not a statement of fact, but I would argue that Colonel H. Jones had this type of system because it was taught to him at senior level, senior command courses, and so had this sort of system, which is you will advance to this point by this time, you will take this piece of land, you will then stop and repair, you will then get these sort of orders, and had a very linear approach. Chris Keeble didn't. Chris Keeble was mission command, which is the other system I'll come to, which was the idea that, right, what's the situation? Number one, and a high trust in his subordinates. He was talking to his company commanders, the next level below. What can you see? So one company commander under Colonel H. Jones's system was stopped by enemy forces. Because you know what? The enemy gets a vote and was stopped dead. Despite their best efforts, they couldn't go any further. Well, that messed up the plan. But Colonel H. Jones then died trying to make that plan continue. And Chris Keeble went back to the company commander and said, what can you see? And you have B and D company, we're free. We can go. There's no enemy in front of us. Rather than being stopped by orders and the plan, they had a free open terrain in front of them. And then Chris Keeble unleashed them. And that unleashing won the battle against the odds. And it's a fantastic battle to read about, and I do recommend it. But that is the key difference, because when you get to Austrad's tactic, it's that performance. You are now going for maximum performance. And this is where you have different principles. So you believe in macro management rather than micromanagement. Micromanagement is people complain about micromanagement all the time, but a lot of the time micromanagement comes from that lack of trust. Trust is key. If you can trust people to get on with it and complete, then you will not shouldn't be seeing micromanagement. There's a view of the overall picture and a belief of the intent to get somewhere, and everybody understands that, and so you can allow decisions to be made without the leader, without the coach. They can make a call. Sometimes that call is better than the one that the leader or the coach, the head coach, will come up with, because they see what is going on in front of them. So there's decentralized control. You have a centralized intent. We're all going to get this. We're going to win gold at the Olympics. We're going to defeat the enemy on this particular. That everybody gets to know what the intent is. That is it. Cool. Right. I now trust you lot to get on with aiming towards that. And that's where decentralized control comes in. You push it down as far as possible. And in World War One, where the British started with the micromanagement with the conscript army, changed its approach in 1917, especially with the Canadian Australian divisions under them, because they suddenly were unleashed with this style of doing things, which made them the greatest shock troops of World War One. So therefore, that decentralized control meant that those nations can use their national cultural identity and the way they do things to greater effect. The British also reacted well to this as well, and to the point where by 1918, November 1918, the British Army and its colonial allies were the greatest army in the world in 1918 because of this system that was developed that had been that they'd accidentally come across, and the Germans had a similar system to this beforehand, but they developed it far better because they learned from losing than the British forgot this in peacetime after World War One. But it's that degree of trust. This system works with trust, it works with training, and it works with everybody knowing what the end state is. And then and then there's all sorts, and we'll say this in the book, there's all sorts of things that come out of that. That is what's the expectations and how you go about that. But it's key on that mental flexibility, openness to ideas and suggestions. Unfortunately, when people are micromanaging, they become so transfixed with their way or the highway. You may have heard that saying, that people won't come to them with the better idea. And you know what? Nobody has a monopoly on good ideas, and Mission Command brings that out. The other system doesn't.
The conscript idea is synonymous with what I was talking about in China, and one of the reasons that similarity popped up is that many of the team sports are trained in a very similar way of not trusting those individuals because they don't come from a background of choosing to do it and being all in. And so they've got to be told, we don't trust you, you will do as I'm told, there's a central intent that I will tell you about, and there'll be also a central management of that. And China has done extraordinarily well in individual sports because that form of micromanagement and repetitive doctrine can work well when the controlling variables are reduced to a single athlete. What they haven't done as well as in team sports, where the enemy gets a say, as you said, and the variables change so much that you have to make use of feedback. You have to make use of the context being as it is, and you have to have some trust that the individuals in the team can organise themselves and a couple of other people around them to adjust to what's going on. And the balance in China is difficult because they've got a hierarchy of individuals who are expecting that they will take that initial doctrine that you talked about of micromanaging. And when that's the expectation, some of these coaches are believing that they will lose their job unless they are seen to be very, very harsh and it's my way or the highway. And I think perhaps one of the greatest examples of a coach not doing that was Jenny Lung Ping, who has won back-to-back World Cups and the Olympic gold with the China women's volleyball team. Now, she's been lucky enough to see different coaching styles by playing in Italy and playing in the United States and coaching there as well, and understanding that this doctrine of you will do it my way and we will do it over and over again and I will drill you and I will drill you and there is no alternative. She has done that to an extent until she has recognised that the circumstances have changed and she needs to adjust. There was a moment when I was with that team, we were perhaps in a southern city of China, we perhaps might have been in Japan, and I'd come down with a bit of an illness and I sat up in the stand for a day or two and just simply observed how they were coaching, and I started to observe the trends, and the trends were that Jenny Lung Ping supposedly was looking as if she was a very, very hard taskmaster. And yet the nuances of her coaching technique indicated that she was using a mission command approach and she was receiving feedback from her athletes. She was making adjustments, and when they got off track, she would go back in and micromanaging, and then she would step away and trust that they would take the lessons learned from that little moment of micromanaging and demonstrate a change in the results, and then she would move on. And the fact that she would move on to the next drill was a clear sign that that individual had done the right thing and that the feedback was taken into account and there was an instantaneous lesson. And she has had the team success because of that, and therefore her techniques are adopted. So we don't see that so much in Western style sports, but we might see it in junior sport, where you'll get a parent coach who wants to imprint their way or the highway, and they have a results focused mentality to training those kids. And because those kids have got a low skill set and they've got a low trainability in some ways, because their attention span is not directed towards strategy and tactics, their attention span is directed towards play. So if you as a parent coach have a results focused intention to win matches, you will do very poorly. What you will need to switch your results focus is, can I keep these kids entertained enough to enjoy what they're doing so that they stay in the game long enough to get to a point where they've actually got the intellectual ability to give me feedback and to trust their context. And so there's a transition between one style and the other, as long as you keep a centralized intent of what is our goal today. And many junior coaches perhaps would do well to recognize that our intent today is to go out there and have a great time so that we can stimulate your little brains and your hearts and your minds. And there are some systems around the world where some parent coaches or volunteer coaches have a hard time sticking to that because they're interested in how can I get this 7-year-old to be picked up on a scholarship to a full fee paying university or college at some point down the track so that they can get a $30 million Major League Baseball contract. And what they fail to remember is that less than 1% of people who go into sport make that kind of interest and money. So the result, really, the focus should always be in sport, should be outlined at the beginning. And unless you are in a World Cup winning match, your result is not to go out there and have fun, but to win the World Cup. But unless you're in that circumstance, it should be, how can we learn and develop so that you can be a better human? And if you're a better human and you like staying in this game and you develop technically to be in a circumstance where you maybe can win a World Cup, that's brilliant. So I see that military command styles, both of them, applied in sport. And the great coaches are results focused, and the ones that are process focused on that micromanaging, well, they die on the battlefield, as you said from H. Jones.
All I'll add though is another way of looking at the two styles is we do actually there's a couple of things I want to introduce here. One is the individual and collective training that we have in the army, and the training and education. So I think these are quite. Greg mentioned this sort of side of things where the building up of the Chinese teams are very good at the individual side of things, but less so on the team side. I think that's another understanding of the way the army does things at times as well. So the initial phase one training, we have a lot of individual training, the skills of the individual themselves, and there's a lot of training. Monkey see, monkey do. Repeat, practice, getting that muscle memory in of the physical conditioning, the attention to detail, the marching, the drill, the marching, same thing, but weapon handling, shooting skills, and just practicing, and that's a training element where a lot of micromanagement is good. Actually, it's a good thing to be doing with the new material in, with recruits and getting that and get used to that muscle memory. And the amount of times that even as later on, so I left the army and I came back in after a few years, and the muscle memory of things like ironing the uniform in a very, very diligent manner, whereas before I'd be like, I'll do, yeah. Whereas going back in the army, like, oh, hang on a minute, got to make sure you then suddenly the muscle memory and the training and the micromanagement actually comes in and is effective. It works, but it's got to know where its place is. And that's where the individual side starting is fine because you've got the less. but then the trust builds up, and then you get to things like collective training, and what I like to call the difference between training and education. Because then when you go into the team things, and the enemy has a vote, whether it's a team sport or a war, you're then having to deal with situations that you hadn't planned for, you hadn't got into consideration. And people have got to have a mental flexibility, a mental ability to deal with the thing in front of them. Now, education is a fact of giving you a lot of tools that can deal with a new situation, whereas training, the situation, you know you're going to shoot at that target. Training, therefore, is training for the known thing. Education is going towards the unknown thing and having tools to be able to deal with that better. And that is a crucial difference between the two. But also individual to collective training. When you're doing collective training, you've got to have that higher degree of trust in that the individual training is now come to the fore and they know their stuff there. And the subordinate commanders are now able to make their soldiers do the thing that they need to do to fulfill a centralized training intent, which does need a hell of a lot of education, just things being thrown at them. A good colonel, a good commander of a regiment will throw in unexpected serials in a collective training thing to test his officers out, to find out whether or not they can deal with the unexpected. Because that's the thing. In sport and in war, the unexpected is going to happen. And that is when you see the quality of the team. Whether it's a military or sports team, that is the quality. How do they deal with the unexpected? How do they deal with stresses? How do they deal with the being behind, being knocked about? And that is where the education, collective, trust, this more abstract tactique comes into play there. And that's where you're getting towards the performance and the results being shown. And I think that's where we're getting back to the idea of you can got to prove as to where you're going to be. All these building blocks are leading to, and you're proving your journey on the way from the start state to the end state to be saying, how are we getting there? All these are mechanisms to get there. But you've got to use a mixture of the two. You don't need to use the earlier one if they're not junior one new in it. I would argue. And a lot of the people we'll be dealing with actually aren't. I mean, now I'm no longer at phase one training. I expect a level of professionalism and all the soldiers I come across. And in fact, not just expect it, as I say in the chapter. My mission command really relies on trust immediately. Trust on unquestioned immediately. Not you have to earn my trust as a leader. No, trust immediately. You will then prove my trust right or wrong as we go down, but it's there immediately. It's very tricky and it's very dangerous when people let you down and your career can affect them, and it has happened to me, but the results are immense when it does work. Whereas the earning trust, you've just got a whole lot of time to waste as far as I'm concerned. If you're going to earn my trust, how long are you going to put in for that? 6 months, a year? Well, that's 6 months of the year wasted, in my opinion, if you've got a high-performing team.
Yeah. Your description fits perfectly well with scientifically validated methods of how to train movement. And we use movement in all types of athletic endeavours, but the two key phrases there are performance and learning. And learning occurs after a delayed period of time from the process of performing a movement. If you perform a movement repetitively, aka micromanage the circumstance, pull the trigger, rest it on your shoulder, all of these clear instructions, it's block practice. Do it again, do it again, do it again. This block practice has a very, very high success rate for improvement of the performance and the accuracy. However, if you were to not do that activity for approximately 2 days, and then you come back and do a test of the accuracy of the task, there is a fall off in the accuracy. It's not quite as accurate as it was 2 days ago. Now, there's a second method. It's called random practice. And obviously what you're doing there is you're changing the context. You're interfering with that person's movement pattern or their muscle memory, as the words that you talked about the organisation of their body. You're interfering with it. And when you interfere with it, they have to problem solve every single repetition. And their success rate is not particularly good. But because they're doing problem solving on every single repetition, their neural networks are developing so much better than the person who's just doing block practice, doing exactly the same thing over and over again. So what happens is if you left that person for 2 days and came back and did a test, they will typically perform better in that 2 days test than the one who's been doing block practice. And what you're seeing is that there's a very distinct difference between doing well in training and doing well when you leave somebody alone to fester in the world and then put them to the test. And so in the coaching world, one of the ways that we might put this to words is to say, I expect you to genuinely struggle while I'm training you here today. But know that if you struggle today using the methods that I'm giving you, you will do better when you go home or when you go to competition than if I hold your hand through today's training session while you do it perfectly. And the good coach and the good leader knows that you've got to start off with that micromanaging and you've got to start off with that repetitive practice because the person has to have a successful moment. Lee, if you give someone a rifle and you teach them how to shoot and then you just create randomness and they never hit a target, that person's performance in the shooting session is zero because they never hit a target. And their learning is zero because they never had a successful target hit to attach their strategies to. Once you've had that successful moment, you've got a baseline reference and everything is an error detection away from that moment. And so what you've got to use is this repetitive, performance-driven, we've got to get you to have a success. If I've got to hold your hand through it, we will. But once you've got that success and I acknowledge it and you acknowledge it, then I'm going to add some different context and I'm going to start to back away into a different approach.
I mean, that is, I'm flying straight back to my phase 1 training, especially at Purbright when I was in charge of Rangers. Always dangerous for an education officer. But it's that element of getting that first success. You have the live firing packages all the way up to 13, and the most frustrating bit for us, I think I'm going to talk about this later on in the book, but I won't give most of it away, but the most frustrating bit is the element of getting them on target, hit something. And the majority of our time is getting them to do the marksmanship principles, get them to breathe correctly, get them in the right stance, get them in the right thing, and then we're spotting them onto the target. And the big frustration thing is they'll hit left, and then we go, just need to move right a bit, and then they'll hit far right, and I'm like, move left a bit, far left, and I'm like, all right, just move right a bit, far right, and I'm like, right, okay, I want to kill you now. Okay, stay calm. And the coaches, good coach, there's a difference between the good and bad coaches on this, and it really does test the patience. But this is the thing, they've not got the successful measurement to then base that upon, and then therefore they keep missing. The moment they hit, it is that eureka moment, that moment of going, the confidence swells. You can see it and feel it, even though you're not looking at each other in the face. You can feel the shoulders go up. All the confidence starts. There's a lot and excitement usually on a good coach. It's like, you did it, yes! And it's like a team effort between them. We both did it. You hit it and we did it. Excellent. And then you've got that. Now we know where you are. And this is like always leading up to the zeroing side to make sure the weapon is keyed onto the individual, onto the individual and the weapon are one. That's the whole point of zeroing. And then you have that. And as soon as they've got that, the ability for them to self-correct their state without somebody being there is enhanced, and that goes up steadily. And that's the difference. Once you've broken through, that micromanagement becomes less and less needed. Because, as I say, when you go in that realm of self-correction, self-awareness, self-knowledge, you know how to make yourself better. That's where all that time and effort the coaches put in at the beginning that was painful, that made you swear in your head because you're professional. and all that going on comes to the fore, because then you're seeing them and you're watching from a distance, and you got that smile, and you're just thinking, that's my soldier there, look at them go, because you can see that they are just going, and they're cursing to themselves because they know they're not, but they know what to do to correct it. And then at the end, when they all pass their APWT, their annual personal weapon test, that's when the pride comes from the team as well, and that is a result to be measured.
Yeah, and clearly we have a different challenge ahead of us if you have a team sport where the variables of skill acquisition and skill execution may not be the determinant of having success in that team, where you have opposition members doing things that suddenly throw you off course and your self-correction's too late. And you have team members as well on the same team who are just not up to the same level of skill execution, or even the same awareness that if you do a skill error that you're going to need to do a correction. But we'll have to come to that to another time as to how we take some of these lessons into not just away from our individual skill executions, but also the team ones. And of course, there's many examples in the book. So we will wrap up our chapter 1 episode, and we will see you in the next episode for chapter 2.
I was going to say, I just wanted to come to make a little summary myself.
Certainly, this is the appendix to chapter 2, episode 1. Go ahead.
Just what you'll see from this chapter, we end with again reiterating the key elements of the chapter, which is the sense of telling, directing, and involving, and that is, just those 3 words really does give you the idea of where we're going down on that spectrum. The telling and directing, as we discussed during this, is necessary. Of course it is. At the beginning, we're keeping it in its right place. There will be more or less need for telling and directing depending on the experience and motivation and the skills of the individuals to start with. But really, you are aiming towards that involving, that's getting them to the point where they're in charge of their own destiny. And that will then lead to those results coming in, and then getting back to the point of where we talked about of knowing the start state, and then once they start doing that self-awareness, that self-correcting and involving themselves, then the results will start coming in. Some of the times it can be frustrating to wait for them, but trust it will work.